Think about the last time you got sick. A throat infection maybe. A chest that wouldn't clear. You probably went to a pharmacy and came back with a bottle of something that cost $20, tasted like synthetic grape, and wiped out your gut for 2 weeks. You traded one problem for 3. Now consider this. 3,000 years ago, a shepherd king wrote a line in a song that described something that could have handled that infection without touching your gut at all. He called it ezov. We translated it as hyssop. And then we spent 5 centuries looking at the wrong plant. The line is from Psalm 51. "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean." For most of church history, that verse was treated as spiritual poetry. But the Hebrews weren't using ezov just in poetry. They were using it everywhere contamination appeared. Lepers were cleansed with it. Homes infected with mold were treated with it. They didn't have a word for bacteria. They didn't have a microscope. What they had was 1,000 years of watching what worked. Then modern science finally looked at this plant, and what came back from the laboratory confirmed everything, and raised one question the pharmaceutical industry has never cleanly answered. Why does a compound that outperforms bleach, defeats drug-resistant bacteria, and grows freely in any sunny garden appear on 0 hospital formularies, 0 pharmacy shelves, and 0 prescription pads in the Western world? That answer has nothing to do with the plant, and everything to do with who profits when you stay sick. Welcome to Lost Green Lore. If you enjoy this kind of content, you will really help us out if you could like the video and hit that subscribe button. Thank you. Now moving on. You see, the plant didn't disappear because it stopped growing. It disappeared because someone gave it the wrong name, and the wrong name stuck for 400 years. To understand how that happens, you have to go back to Alexandria, around 200 years before Christ. A group of Jewish scholars was commissioned to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the language of the educated world at the time. When they reached the Hebrew word ezov, they needed a Greek equivalent. The closest sounding word they had was Hyssopus. It wasn't a perfect botanical match, but they were working across a language barrier, not a plant catalog. So Hyssopus it became, and that decision sat quietly in the text for centuries. Then Europe got hold of the scriptures. Medieval translators working in England, France, and Germany were not botanists. They were monks who knew the plants outside their monastery walls, not the aromatic shrubs of the Levantine hillsides. When they encountered Hyssopus, they landed on what was familiar: Hyssopus officinalis, a pretty purple-flowering herb common across temperate Europe. The problem is that Hyssopus officinalis has never grown in Palestine. Not historically, not naturally. The plant named in most Bibles has never set a single root in the soil where the Bible was written. What makes this worse is that an earlier translation got it right. When Jerome produced the Latin Vulgate in the 4th century, he rendered ezov as Origanum, the Latin word for oregano. Then, 1611 arrived. The King James Bible followed the Greek, printed hyssop, and distributed that error across the English-speaking world in the most widely printed book in human history. The real plant kept growing in the same rocky terraces it had always occupied. People in the Levant kept drying it, crushing it into spice blends, pressing it into bread. They just called it by a different name. They called it za'atar. And that's where the story takes its strangest turn, because the lost biblical herb was still sitting on kitchen tables, folded into flatbread, and sprinkled over breakfast, waiting for modern labs to catch up. For most of the 20th century, the idea that a biblical herb could outperform a pharmaceutical antiseptic would have been dismissed as folklore. Science had its own tools now: carbolic acid, quaternary ammonium compounds, and eventually broad-spectrum antibiotics. It wasn't looking for answers in a 3,000-year-old spice blend, but the labs found it anyway. When researchers began running chemical analyses on Origanum syriacum, the plant the ancient Hebrews called ezov and the Middle East never stopped calling za'atar. What came back from the gas chromatography wasn't subtle. The essential oil contained carvacrol, a phenolic compound, at concentrations as high as 80% of its total composition. That number matters because carvacrol is not a gentle compound. It doesn't slow bacterial growth the way many antibiotics do. It goes directly for the cell membrane. embeds itself into the lipid layer that holds a bacterial cell together, and causes it to leak its contents until it collapses. The bacterium doesn't adapt to that process. There is no resistance mechanism that rebuilds a membrane faster than carvacrol can destroy it. This is the detail that separates it from most of what you'd find in a medicine cabinet. For decades, the most stubborn problem in modern hospital medicine has been a strain of staph bacteria called MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It has evolved to defeat nearly every synthetic antibiotic thrown at it, and once it establishes itself in a ward, it is extraordinarily difficult to remove. Hospitals track outbreaks the way air traffic controllers track storms, quietly, constantly, and with the full understanding that losing control carries a body count. In 2025, researchers tested carvacrol directly against clinical MRSA strains. What made the results significant wasn't just that carvacrol inhibited the bacteria, it was how. MRSA's resistance is built around enzymatic defenses, biological mechanisms that identify and neutralize the synthetic compounds antibiotics use to attack it. Carvacrol doesn't use those pathways. It goes straight for the cell membrane, a target that MRSA's resistance architecture was never designed to protect. The bacteria had spent generations learning to defeat one kind of weapon. Carvacrol was an entirely different kind. The antibacterial results alone would have been enough to make this plant remarkable. But carvacrol doesn't stop at bacteria. Studies have documented its antiviral activity against several clinically significant viruses, with research indicating it disrupts the lipid envelope that certain viruses use to penetrate host cells, the same membrane-targeting mechanism it deploys against bacteria. A compound that attacks the structural integrity of both bacterial cell walls and viral envelopes is not operating like anything currently sitting in a pharmacy. It is operating like bleach, but one you can consume without consequence. The antifungal results pointed in the same direction, which brings the story back to Leviticus 14, a detailed protocol for treating mold in the walls of a house, using ezov throughout the cleansing process. For centuries, that passage was read as ceremonial, a symbolic gesture dressed in religious language. It was a mold remediation protocol. The ancient Hebrews had no microscopes, no gas chromatography. What they had was centuries of careful observation, a slow, empirical record of what worked. And what they recorded was accurate enough that modern laboratory science spent decades arriving at the same conclusions. They were right. They just didn't know why. Think about the last course of antibiotics you took. The infection cleared, but something in your digestion felt wrong for weeks afterward. Your appetite was off. Your stomach was unpredictable. What happened is that the antibiotic did its job and then kept going. It cleared the infection and also cleared a significant portion of the beneficial bacteria your gut depends on to function. You solved one problem and created another. This is not a minor side effect. The gut microbiome regulates digestion, immune response, and the production of certain neurotransmitters. Disrupting it with broad-spectrum antibiotics is like putting out a kitchen fire with a fire hose. The fire goes out, so does everything else. Carvacrol works differently. The mechanism that makes it effective against pathogens, embedding into lipid-based cell membranes and destabilizing them, is selective in a way that broad-spectrum antibiotics are not. Beneficial gut bacteria carry different membrane compositions than the pathogens carvacrol targets most aggressively. The plant was consumed regularly across centuries of Middle Eastern medicine as food, tea, and medicine, without the digestive disruption associated with pharmaceutical antibiotics. The gut was never the collateral damage. For respiratory infections, the essential oil reaches the mucosal tissue of the throat and lungs directly when inhaled through steam or consumed as a strong tea. Bronchitis, chronic cough, and congestion were among the primary conditions it addressed for centuries, and modern phytochemical research has since found the biological explanation. Carvacrol and its companion, compound thymol, act directly on infected tissue in the respiratory tract. Thymol is worth pausing on. It is the active component in Listerine, used for over a century against the bacteria responsible for gum disease and throat infections. The pharmaceutical industry identified it, isolated it, put it in a branded bottle, and sold it back to the public. The plant containing both thymol and carvacrol together in their natural ratio has been sitting in Middle Eastern spice markets the entire time. The ancient world didn't have the language for any of this, but they knew which plant to reach for when someone's lungs filled up in winter. They just happened to be right. But then why did it disappear? To understand how that happened, you have to go back to 1865. A British surgeon named Joseph Lister was applying carbolic acid, a synthetic chemical derived from coal tar, to surgical instruments and wounds at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. Infection rates dropped dramatically. The medical world took notice. Lister's results gave the emerging chemical industry something it had never had before: a scientific framework that positioned synthetic compounds as the legitimate modern answer to infection. Plant-based remedies, however effective their centuries of use had made them, suddenly looked unscientific by comparison. Not because the evidence said so, because the framing did. In 1889, Lysol arrived. By 1918, it was being advertised as a frontline defense against the Spanish flu. It was in hospitals, in homes, in the recommendations of physicians. It was everywhere a plant-based antiseptic had once been. The structural reason is simple: you cannot patent a plant. Carvacrol exists in nature. Without a patent, there is no protected market. Without a protected market, there is no return on clinical trial investment. And without clinical trials, there is no regulatory approval. The system was not designed with malicious intent toward plant medicine, but it rewarded compounds that could be owned. A plant anyone could grow in their backyard offered no entry point into that cycle at any stage. So the investment never came. The trials were never funded. The plant stopped being taught in medical schools, stopped appearing in pharmacopoeias, and stopped being the thing a physician reached for. The chemical industry didn't erase it. The economics of the patent system made it unprofitable to remember. While Western medicine was building its infrastructure of patents and synthetic compounds, something interesting was happening in the villages of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. Nothing changed. The plant kept growing on rocky terraces and sun-baked hillsides. Mothers kept steeping it in hot water for children with chest infections. Bakers kept pressing the dried, crushed leaves into flatbread pulled fresh from clay ovens. The knowledge didn't need an institution to preserve it. It was woven into daily life so completely that there was nothing to preserve. It was simply what people did. They called it za'atar. In Middle Eastern households, za'atar is not a specialty ingredient. It is a staple. It sits on the table the way salt and pepper sit on tables in the West. Children eat it before school. Elderly people eat it daily into their 90s. The culture never developed a separation between the plant as food and the plant as medicine, because in the tradition that preserved it, that separation never made sense to begin with. The Western medical tradition drew a hard line between food and medicine in the 19th century. Something was either a food or a drug. Origanum syriacum fell into the gap between those two categories and disappeared from institutional view entirely. In the Levantine tradition, that gap simply doesn't exist. A plant that tastes good and heals you is not a paradox. It is just a good plant. Medical traditions get disrupted. Pharmacopoeias get revised. But food culture is passed from hand to hand across generations in a way that is extraordinarily resistant to erasure. The za'atar eaten in Beirut today is not meaningfully different from what was eaten in the same region 2,000 years ago. What the West spent decades trying to rediscover in laboratories, the Levant never stopped practicing at breakfast. Ethnobotanists and biblical botanists have since confirmed what Middle Eastern grandmothers never doubted, that ezov and za'atar are the same plant, the same tradition, and the same medicine. The correction has made it into academic literature and botanical encyclopedias. It has not yet made it into the pharmacy, but it has always been in the kitchen. And for 3,000 years, that was enough. So, what do you think? Should we bring it back and accept it? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more amazing videos like this one.